Thanks, Leah. Hello, everyone. My name's Mary Louise, and I'm the Managing Director here at ATEM, and I'm delighted to welcome you all today for our third Bold Conversation of the year. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri country here in the inner north of Melbourne. It's been a beautiful spring day, one of those days that you get outside and rejoice at that nice warm air. Before we get started, I just would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands of where we gather today across Australia and New Zealand. I would like to pay our respects to elders past and present, acknowledge our gratitude that we share this land today, my sorrow for some of the costs of that sharing, and my hope and belief that we can move to a place of equity, justice, and partnership together. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Sophie Heyman on the other side of the ditch to share the welcome and the acknowledgements.
Kia ora, ML. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Greetings, greetings to you all. Tēnā koutou katoa ko hui hui, mai nei I runga I te kaupapa o tēnei rā. Greetings to us all who've gathered here today. Ka nui te mihi, ka nui te mihi, ka nui te araha, kia koutou katoa. Much love to you all. Kei te hari, kei te ko te nako, kia kite, ia koutou. It brings me joy. My heart is happy to see you all here today. Nō reira, Professor Barney Glover, Professor Giselle Byrnes, Professor or Dr. Stephen Weller, ML, aku hoa mahi, colleagues, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora.
Sophie, thank you so much for that. It just brings me joy just to be able to share the welcome to everyone, to hear those words and the Maori acknowledgement as well. Just quickly, I just want to say thank you to everyone for making time in their day to be with us. I can remember a year ago sitting down with Professor Barney Glover and Professor Jan Thomas to talk about how they would like to take up their roles as patrons of ATEM, and from that discussion came Bold Conversations. And to see us arrive at this third one, to see to get the feedback from people who've been involved in the first two about the opportunity to contribute to a really deep dive conversation. It's really exciting for us, the team here at ATEM, to bring this to you. Today's not a webinar or a scripted speech. It's really a unique opportunity to explore something that's really topical across our region. It's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's discussion. I'm sure many of you know Dr. Stephen Weller, COO and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at ACU. I could spend the next 30 minutes talking about his CV, but I will pass on that. But there was two things that I will say. I would just want to acknowledge that Stephen is the past president of ATEM, and we carry on his legacy of contribution to the sector, and he's a wonderful raconteur, and so well placed to lead today's discussion. Stephen, if I could hand over to you.
Thanks, ML. Delighted to be amongst colleagues, and my congratulations to you and the ATEM board for these bold conversations. In the same way, you're going to hear nothing about my CV. You're going to hear nothing about the CV of our two panellists today. Let me make a brief comment about them and give you some context, and then we're going to go straight into it because we've got about an hour and 20 minutes. We want to have a conversation, a bold conversation between them, and then we want the opportunity for you to have questions and chat. Please feel free to put chat in. If you want to make a comment, you want to make a statement, the panel will watch it. We are joined, as you know, by Professor Barney Glover, Vice-Chancellor and President, Western Sydney University, and by Professor Giselle Byrnes at Massey University. Barney as an ATEM patron, Giselle representing the Aotearoa patron. we are privileged with the perspective that they both bring. Barney, obviously, through his role as a Vice-Chancellor and President in Australia, but also in the privileged position of having been part of the Accord panel. Giselle bringing us the perspective from Aotearoa, but herself having spent time working in Australia and so an understanding. We've got about 80 or so of you joining today and a good contingent representing both countries. I'm going to go straight into the scene. We're going to start with a little bit of political context. We're going to move into sort of funding and access. That'll take us into equity and participation. I'm going to touch on two sort of thematic areas around regional and remote delivery, as well as quality of teaching and digital, and end, I guess, on that sort of the context of the Commission, because I think it's particularly where there's an opportunity. The Accord talks about a proposed Commission. New Zealand has a Commission, and so the perspectives there are key. Barney, I'm going to come to you first. I'm going to channel the Minister and go to his deliberate pick of the cover image, big, bold and spiky. It's clearly a time for being bold. There you go. We can just see the echidna. Thank you very much. Start with the political context, if I can, both from your perspective, obviously, as a Vice-Chancellor, but again, the panel context.
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's great to have a chance to participate in another one of these bold conversations. It's great to have Giselle here to represent Jan, who couldn't be with us as the New Zealand patron, but I've worked with Giselle for a long time, so it's great to have Giselle here. I'm sure we'll have a wonderful conversation. Look, from the Australian side, at the moment, we're going through the Universities Accord review commissioned by our Minister, Jason Clare. We're coming to the sharp end of it. So we've been through the interim report and now in the process of the consultation on that. There's been about 307 submissions so far to the responses to the interim report. So that's great. It was good to have a briefing on them yesterday when we had an Accord panel meeting. That's about the same number we got for the initial consultation paper. So I think it demonstrates the interest in the sector. We're going through a process now of finalising recommendations, and they'll come through to the Minister in December. And I imagine the Minister will make a response in the new year. But just to pick up the political context here, and I'm sure Giselle would have an interesting perspective with elections looming in New Zealand. You know, we've seen significant changes in Australia in the political landscape in recent years, particularly now a federal Labor government here. We have all but one state and territory that is now Labor controlled, Labor governments in place. So that puts a particularly interesting context on national reform and the opportunity for national reform. So, for example, not only did Jason Clare commission the Higher Education Review, he actually commissioned 3 major education reviews. And I think this is important in the political context of what we anticipate seeing next year. First of all, the work that Deborah Brennan is doing on early childhood, that Lisa O'Brien is doing. That was my dog barking in the background. Lisa O'Brien doing, obviously not happy with my presentation today, on school reform, and Mary O'Kane on higher education reform. So it's a really interesting moment. These come together over the course of the next few months, and we'll need to see a government in Australia at the federal level, probably importantly contrasting with some of the developments in New Zealand, but we'll see a government in Australia needing to respond in a generationally significant way to those 3 reviews. So the politics are pretty sharp on this one, that you don't go ahead commissioning reviews of this nature and this magnitude, independent reviews of government, and not have a responsibility to follow up with, I think, a very significant response. So I think the politics are sharp. The next few months are critical, Stephen, and I think we're looking forward to an education budget in 2024.
Thanks, Barney. Appreciate that. Giselle, can I come to you? We're talking about a moment in Australian politics, as Barney's talked about, but of course, it's an equally a moment in New Zealand politics. You have an election coming up.
Sorry, I don't know how to not do this.
Somebody's talking, and it would be good if they could mute themselves. If maybe a good opportunity, if you're not on mute, you put yourself on mute unless you're one of the panelists. Giselle, can I come to you to think about that political context in New Zealand, but again, feel free to look to the context across the two.
Yeah, kia ora koutou katoa, and ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Stephen, ngā mihi nui Barney. Wonderful to have the opportunity to represent Jan today and to have a bold conversation with the both of you. It is indeed a moment of time in Aotearoa New Zealand. We are having a general election in the middle of October, not too far away. And of course, just two things to say. One is that we've been keenly following the progression of the Accord in Australia, and following that with deep interest, and particularly some of the interim recommendations. And with the forthcoming general election, I think there's probably a great deal of uncertainty in our sector at the moment. We are, many of us, still navigating a post-COVID hangover. So times are really tough financially across the tertiary education sector. In the last year, our country has set up Te Kunenga, the National Institute for Skills, so essentially bringing all the 16 polytechs together. So there's been some pretty major reform. The policies have been really slow to come out on education thus far. The National Party have said that their one big policy statement is that they're going to roll back to Pūkenga and roll back those vocational education reforms. Lord knows how they will do it, because there's been a lot of investment to date on that. And because we have an MMP system here, it's quite likely that there'll be a very mixed parliament. Some of the pundits are predicting that we might swing to the right. If that is the case, then our government departments and government agencies will be really under scrutiny. And I think there's a bit of concern around that. But I think whatever shade of government we have post-October, there's still going to be a very strong focus on equity, on access, on the participation agenda. And I also think that, the focus is going to remain, certainly for the university sector, on full cost of research funding and so on. So pushing back on the years and years and years of compliance that we've had. So it's a little bit uncertain at the moment, but it is a bit of a tipping point for us too, Stephen.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks, Giselle. I'll stay with you if I can, because I want to move us from the political to not money. I understand money's important. Barney's made the context of a federal budget, but access is a key theme across both countries, and a key theme that's common. We know the power of the sector that we work in, but we know it's not an equally distributed sector. Two countries have had a similar experience: the decline of international, now a return of international, a decline of domestic, and challenges of funding. Giselle, if I can stick with you at the moment, that maybe drill more into that sense about, if you were giving bold advice into an election, how do you deal with that issue of enhanced access but limited funding?
Yeah, so I think it's, the critical thing is, let's protect the core mission and purpose of universities. Let's simplify the system in which we operate. In Aotearoa New Zealand, all of the tertiary providers really operate under the burden of enormous bureaucracy, enormous compliance. And in addition, Stephen, and you may be aware of this, the universities are not self-accrediting. So we are autonomous, but not self-accrediting. So I think there's a range of issues there around the sort of compliance costs that we are constantly battling. That includes, I think, last year we had introduced the Code of Pastoral Care for students. That includes international students, and I think that's something that you've gestured towards in the Accord report, at least looking into that sort of pastoral care and wellbeing for students, something perhaps we can touch on. But if I was to advise a incoming government, Stephen, it would be really simplify, simplify, simplify. You know, here in Aotearoa, our polytechs also teach degrees. That decision was made many years ago, but it does mean that effectively polytech staff are competing with university staff for research funds, in addition to, you know, competing for students in the same degree programs. So I think we've kind of got wound up on that duplication thing, and we've got to inject a bit of common sense and simplicity into the system. In addition, Stephen, because you mentioned equity, we have this really strong focus to lift the participation levels across the sector, and we have this big audacious goal as a whole tertiary sector to close those parity gaps, particularly between Māori learners and Pacific learners and all other learners, and to do that by about 2030. So that's across all modes, you know, taking into account all those differences across our various providers. And so that equity lens has really been seen and defined through ethnicity, for want of a better term, and that is really driven by the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and our nation is on this path to realise and deliver on the promises of the 1840 Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So massive changes in our society, and so I think in many ways the education sector at all levels, frankly, is reflecting that journey that we're on.
Yeah, thanks, Giselle. Barney, if I come to you, I won't ask you what's your bold advice to the Minister, because you've put your name to the report. And let's also remember you've got the opportunity that the Minister is a good local member and a good supporter. The Accord interim report casts this idea of what would be one of the largest expansions in the Australian sector since the demand-driven system. And of course, questions then come, does that mean more universities? Does it mean different universities? But again, can I ask you to sort of that funding and access and the tension between, do we need more? If we need more, who pays for the more, etc.?
Yeah, no, there's a lot in that, Stephen. It's interesting listening to Giselle's comments about just how similar some of the challenges are. We often, you know, I think one thing that's come through the interim report, there are references to our friends across the ditch, because we are looking at some of the things that New Zealand has done and saying, wow, okay, let's have a look at this in the Australian context and see if we can pick out some of those elements. You take income contingent loans that we both use, but in very different ways. And I think we, in some ways, envy the approach that New Zealand has taken to income contingent loans, not just for tuition fees, but also for support for cost of living and living allowances. And one of those issues for the Accord is not just about funding versus access. It's also, how do we ensure students have the resources they need to actually study? How do they have the resources they need to take placements? Placement poverty has become a huge discussion point right through the Accord process, and you see that in the interim report. The growth question that you came to, and then funding versus access, is a really important one. So, you know, there is some data that we obtained through some commissioned work for the Accord, which suggests, you know, that we have some significant skill shortages in Australia ahead of us, not just in the long term, but in the very, very short term. So there is a skill gap that we need to address, assuming the sort of economy we want in Australia, and assuming the sort of society we want to live in, because both of those elements, if you're looking at this from a Treasury perspective, you know, we'd like our colleagues in Treasury and Finance to appreciate that their decisions when it comes to recommendations to government on funding should reflect something about the society that we have in Australia and we want to maintain into the future and improve upon in a year in which the voice is so important to us in Australia. But equally, how do we change this economy? And to pull something out of left field and throw it in the mix here a little bit, the impact the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is going to have on the world economy. Now, this is an extraordinary piece of legislation under the Biden administration, which is already biting to change the nature of the way the US will engage with the rest of the world in some areas of extraordinary importance in R&D and higher education, because of the way the industry sectors will tool up to really pull closer to the US some of their important sovereign risk issues for offshore technologies. Now, that's just one example of a global challenge that impacts on Australia and New Zealand and every country in the world. We've got to understand the geopolitical context about the future of Australia. So yes, if we understand the sort of society and the sort of economy we want, there is a real need then to address the data telling us that there's a skill shortage. And as Giselle mentioned a moment ago, equally important here, how do we address some of the gaps, particularly in equity groups? And I'm very proud of the fact the interim report very strongly expresses the view that First Nations Australians are at the heart of this reform package. And I'm very pleased that the first series of recommendations that we made have been accepted by government and now being legislated. So that's rapid action by the Albanese government to respond to the recommendations. One of them was to expand the demand-driven system to all Indigenous Australians. I think that's a very important step. But fundamentally, there's almost a selfish reason underlying all of this. And that is that we don't believe that we can address the skills challenge unless we can develop greater participation and access for equity groups. It's growth to address the skills shortage through equity participation in higher education, because that's where the most significant gaps are. That's where we haven't closed the gaps. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about access in a moment. Just coming to the funding equity at a moment. Coming to the funding question is very interesting. And I think we, again, share a lot in common here, because right at the moment, almost every Australian university last year was in deficit. Now, there are a variety of reasons for that coming out of COVID, partly because we have a hot economy and a lot of students are choosing, prospective students are choosing either not to study as intensively or to take a little time out of higher education or tertiary education. There's a little bit of that. So softness in load is certainly contributing to us. There's a little post-COVID malaise here that we need to pick up on. Some really interesting articles in Australia today about the mental health of a lot of young people in Australia who've experienced the real challenges of COVID and have come out of that pandemic and now are not really in a position to engage as they might want to in higher education. So that's a worry to us as well. So there is a funding challenge here of significant dimension for the Australian government to address. I anticipate, and I'd be interested in Giselle's thoughts on this, I anticipate a significant number of Australian universities will be in deficit again this year at the operational level. And I would imagine those that were in surplus last year will see that positive position eroded because of the circumstances here. And I imagine we are in a period in which it's going to take longer to recover. International education is robust, but not nearly robust enough, I think, to compensate for what we're seeing domestically. So the challenge for the Accord, and this is a real challenge, in some ways I think unanticipated, we're going through a period of decline, whether it's cyclic decline or not, just to be seen, in domestic student engagement in the sector, rebounding of international education, a significant skills shortage. So questions of access, participation, funding, success are really at the core of what we need to extract politically from this process. And I think both countries share this same moment in time, Giselle. My sense is you're not dissimilar. Your universities are challenged financially as well.
Absolutely, Barney, we are. And, you know, to your point around equity, I mean, well done to you and the panel for shining such a spotlight on First Nations Indigenous learners and making that such a critical core part of the report and the recommendations. That's fabulous. And I think fundamental to the future. To your observation around finances, absolutely, we share a common operating model. And one of the things that, you know, this is a space for a bold conversation. One of the bold questions I think that I'm not sure we're really wrestling with is our fundamental operating model, which was exposed to be so fragile throughout COVID, And yet, I think probably most of us are in that space where we are seeking and welcoming the return of full fee-paying international students. But we know, and there is some cognitive dissonance here, we know that, you know, there's that cross-subsidisation to continue the core business of what we're doing. And in the absence of major structural change that really can help us rethink the operating model, what else can we do? I mean, I think that's a rhetorical question, but certainly, Barney, in the context of New Zealand, I think at least 6 of the 8 New Zealand universities are posting a deficit again for this year, or they're predicting that, and possibly for next year. And I think one of the real concerns that we have in our country is that we're public institutions. We need to prudently manage public funds year after year of deficit. What kind of message does that send? What kind of action might a future government take? Those of us in the university sector are looking at the consolidation of the polytech sector, which seemed to be, if I can speak frankly, a solution in search of a problem, because it's simply been to this date a consolidation of problems together, and the work is now underway to work out an operating model. And that may be the way that we need to go. Maybe we do need to have the hard discussion about how many universities we can sustain, and what is the future shape and structure and scale of our sector. Does sustainability always need to be linked to growth? Is that a given? The current environment, yes, it is. But I think that's the bit that we're not talking about. And you will be aware that the Labour government has mooted the possibility of a higher education funding review here in New Zealand, which I think will be quite focused on the funding issue. So I don't think, Barney, it'll go as broad and be as ambitious as the Accord, but I think it will answer the question, or seek to, around what do we need to do as a nation in order to ensure our universities are sustainable? Because we are, as you intimate, in that space where not only are we looking at projected deficits, we're actually having a conversation about how we can save certain disciplines and subjects. And that speaks to the role of a Tertiary Education Commission, that ideally should be that coordinating, facilitating, in partnership with the Ministry of Education and so on. But that's the critical point that we've got to. But I think there's a kind of warning signs, that we need to make some major structural change.
Yeah, can I just pick that up, Stephen, before we go on? I think it's a very insightful point, Giselle. And you'll see elements in the interim report in the Accord context where we do really start to tease out some bold ideas around the operating model of this that has underpinned the sector for so long and has left us in a very interesting relationship with our Commonwealth government. We're largely in a transactional financial load reconciliation model of engagement. It's not a strategic discussion at all. It's not a long-term discussion. It's not a discussion around the role that's expected by government of universities in a whole range of ways, from community resilience through to highly tactical research responses in the applied context. And I think, you'll see it. It's in the interim report. There are discussions of new funding models that begin to recognise the breadth of activity that's expected of our universities. And in the Australian context, let's talk about post the most difficult periods of climate change-induced flood and fire and very serious natural disasters in Australia, and the role that universities played at the community level in the recovery process, but in the response process as well. It's just one example where we expect a great deal of our universities. The cyclone responses of James Cook and Charles Darwin, you and I know Charles Darwin well. They are just examples, I think, of the fact that we have great expectation. The community has great expectations of our universities, but yet our funding model is not consistent with that. And I think it does not allow us to manage effectively through volatile cyclic periods, whether it's geopolitically impacting on international load or it's domestic circumstance impacting on domestic load. If that's the conversation we have, then we're losing, I think, a huge amount of opportunity to see universities at the core of economic growth, recovery to a certain extent, and the sort of society we want to live in. So I think the elements are there in the interim report. Again, it's a bold discussion to have around how we upend. And I think there's even, bolder conversations, Giselle, about the systemic response to this. You alluded to a number of universities in New Zealand. Well, in Australia, right at the moment, we have conversations in 2 states, in Western Australia and South Australia, around either mergers or are there new models that we should start to explore. In the interim report, interesting model, I'm sure you've looked at this, Giselle, national regional university idea. What would that mean? Stephen might like to tease out what that might mean. These are systemic responses in a sense, and I think worthy of some really serious consideration. I'm sure we're going to get some interesting comments in the responses, but no, I agree with Giselle, Stephen, a lot in this around whether the operating model is broken.
Sure. I will come to the issue of that regional one. I wanted, Giselle, for you to maybe just speak briefly to an issue that you touched on, which again is a key feature in the report, that code of pastoral care. We know that equity is a key issue in the context of access, but as Barney's also said, it's not just access then, it's success. And the Accord panel does talk about, and there's a significant interest in Australia, hey, have you seen this proposed legislation? Are you seeing they're going to ask us to guarantee students? What is that, given Aotearoa is ahead of us in that sense, albeit still at an early, have you got some, I guess, bold advice back to Australia on the experience of that code of pastoral care? And then I might get Barney to respond.
Yeah. Oh, kia ora, Stephen. Yeah. Not sure about the bold advice back to Australia. What I would say is that, universities, I think, have been on a journey where we have, frankly, if you look at this in a historical sense, we've shifted, I think, from being teacher-centric institutions. We're on this journey to be much more student-centric. But that latter piece has really only been, I would say, in the last, couple of decades at most, right? So every university's got to focus on student success. Largely, I think it's probably fair to say, in the higher education literature bears this out, that that's really focused on the what happens outside the classroom, beyond the curriculum. Some of the work we're doing here at Massey and other universities in New Zealand, we're getting in, joining those two things together to make a more holistic approach. What the Code of Pastoral Care does is puts another layer on top of that. So universities, as tertiary providers, are accountable and responsible for the well-being of students, for understanding that our students are actually in spaces that are healthy. I mean physical, I mean mental. There's a whole range of accountabilities that we have under that legislation. Really hard for a provider like Massey, where more than 60% of our learners are studying online and at distance. How do we verify that? How do we ensure that we can acquit on our responsibilities? But I think it's just, it's the right thing to do morally, right? I don't think there's any argument about that. However, it's just another in a cascade of expectations sitting on universities. And as Barney alluded to a moment ago, there's more and more that is being asked of us, and we're having to stretch our dollar effectively to cover that. So there's no extra money in the pot that comes alongside those sorts of expectations. Interestingly, here in New Zealand, for the last 3 years, every tertiary provider has been working on a student success plan, which has been heavily monitored and indeed mandated by the TEC. It's all about achieving equity and parity between priority groups, Māori learners, Pacific learners, and now disabled learners and all other learners. In the last 2 weeks, the Tertiary Education Commission has announced that they're going to invest $10 million in good ideas, and they've announced a fund, details yet to follow. One gets the sense that this is a pre-election announcement because no further details have been forthcoming. However, my point is that the expectations are sort of layer upon layer, and we desperately want to deliver on those, but they don't come with extra funding. So, back to the point around the operating model, I think being fundamentally broken. if that is the case, how do we rebuild the plane while we're flying it? What does that look like? That's enough of an existential crisis, I think, to try and wrap our heads around.
Yeah, thanks, Giselle. Barney, I'm keen to get your response, and let me maybe ask my one really bold question in the sense of it's hard to disagree with all of what's proposed around enhanced student support, the model in New Zealand. But of course, you then start to think, hang on, does that mean we have to, how do we do that? How are we going to report? Did you find yourself at some level of tension in the panel here? Great ideas to consider, but then, hang on, are you limiting my authority as a Vice-Chancellor? Are you challenging my self-accrediting capacity?
Well, I won't discuss what happened at the panel. Thanks, Stephen, for suggesting I might, but...
had to try once.
Yeah, you just have to try once. It's a very good idea. Look, this is a very interesting topic to discuss, because I think Giselle is right. Any Vice-Chancellor, any Provost, any senior person in the sector in Australia or New Zealand will realise that we are having a series of compliance and regulatory challenges placed upon us, and that there's not a associated increase in funding. I mean, for example, in Australia, you just take foreign interference as an issue that has become hugely important to us. I'm sure it is in New Zealand. It's a matter of how we follow the guidelines of the University Foreign Interference Task Force set up by the previous government, but supported in a bipartisan way by Labor, and now Labor in government looking to fine-tune and to streamline, but essentially the same guidelines are there. Now that's, I think, a really important instrument. It's a very, very important set of guidelines for us to follow, but there hasn't been an associated funding pool. I think they talked about having some resources in the UK to support foreign interference, nothing in Australia. We've just got to find the resources to do it, and the burden is significant. So yes, I acknowledge that element. But one thing that came through very clearly in the Accord process, through the evidence base we were collecting, but importantly the submissions we received around insecure employment in Australia in universities being an issue that the sector cannot be proud of at all, and isn't, and needs to respond to, but isn't responding to it actively or responding to exposure from the Fair Work Ombudsman. And of course, the serious challenge around the safety and the well-being of our students. Now, I'm very proud that Australian universities on 2 occasions have run national surveys on sexual assault and sexual harassment on university campuses, and I think that's been internationally significant. But have we done enough to respond to those 2 surveys? And I've been openly critical of the fact on the second survey, the report we got did not include recommendations. Individual institutions had to respond to the circumstances they saw pertinent to their institution, whereas the first survey had a very clear set of recommendations at the national level, very strongly endorsed by the Human Rights Commission, that we had to respond to. Now, I think that lack of structure is affecting us now, because we don't have a uniform national position around responding to sexual harm on campuses. That's just one example where the sector, I think, has let itself down in Australia, and there's more we have to do. And hence, I think the Accord panel's recommendation was very, very clear. It said to government, this is a matter for the governance of universities to actually consider. Our strategies in response to employment practices and our responses in terms of student safety. So I think they're vitally important. I think there needs to be, though, as Giselle pointed out, these are quite often onerous requirements from a reporting and compliance perspective. So we've got to work our way through that. But I actually think the sector in Australia certainly has to do better, so that there is an immediate need to respond to that. Now, the recommendation is clear. How the government now implements that is a matter for government. I think they've accepted the recommendation, and I think there'll be dialogue going on with state governments, because state governments and territory governments in Australia control university legislation. So that if there's going to be legislative changes around the expectations on our governing bodies, then that's a matter for states in concert with the Commonwealth. But the idea of doing more around student safety and well-being is something that I think we will see a response from the Australian government, and it will be informed by what we see in New Zealand. And do I think the sector needs to do better? Absolutely. And I think it's one of those moments where we need to embrace the recommendations and make sure that we implement them and that we're accountable and transparent about it.
Yeah. Can I use that to touch on a question that Giselle raised earlier, and Barney, get your thought, and then I'd come to you, Giselle, again, that the idea of the Tertiary Education Commission, a well-established idea in the New Zealand context, an idea that's been discussed at time in the Australian and is now in the report. I won't ask you the question again as a panel member, but I'll ask you the question as a Vice-Chancellor. Does the idea of a Tertiary Education Commission add value to the Australian sector?
It's very hard to divorce the panel hat from the Vice-Chancellor hat. I'm very interested in hearing more from Giselle. Giselle's boldly touched on a couple of comments around the tech in New Zealand, and I know we invited the Chief Executive, I think it was, of the tech, New Zealand Tech, to come over and speak at a recent forum in Canberra in relation to UA organised, that the Minister spoke at and Professor O'Kane spoke at, to get a bit of insight to how a Tertiary Education Commission is structured and functioning in New Zealand. Now, from a Vice-Chancellor perspective, I think we've got to see the Tertiary Education Commission in a bit of historical context first, if I could briefly touch on it. Commissions of this type, university commissions, higher education commissions, have existed in Australia since about 1944. And this was an end of war leading to post-war reconstruction requirement. We needed Australian universities to respond under the Curtin-Chifley governments to the challenges we were going to face at the end of the Second World War. And universities were seen as vital to that. And there needed to be a university commission formed to help guide the way the sector would respond, the way it was funded, the way it engaged with the discipline spread that was required, build the workforce of the future, all of that. You look through the 45 years from there to when it was essentially of one form or another disbanded. It did make, as a concept in Australia, in whatever form it took, very significant contributions to major reforms in Australia. So there is a major policy dimension that I can see being of great value, independent, evidence-based policy advice to government and to the sector in relation to higher education and tertiary education. You know, I think it was really interesting to hear Giselle making comments about what's happening with the sort of polytechnics in New Zealand, what we would see in our big TAFEs in Australia in relation to higher education. So I think there's a dimension there that I could see being of value. The other dimension that has to align here comes back to the question of the business model of Australian universities, because I know as a Vice-Chancellor what I'm looking for is stability, consistency in the relationship we have with the Commonwealth, and time for universities to respond to the changing circumstances and the changing expectations on us. And I think at the moment we don't have that. We have a lot of volatility and a lot of challenge to the sector on a regular basis. So if we have an emerging new operating model for the sector, we have a new dialogue to have with the Commonwealth, we have a Tertiary Education Commission that is set the task of establishing the accord. And it's a subtlety in the interim review, but the accord is meant to be a post-review opportunity to bring together all of the key players, business, industry, unions, government, universities, to address the really difficult challenges facing Australia and how we can work collectively to address those challenges. That process needs to be auspiced, I think, by a Tertiary Education Commission. So yes, there are people saying there could be overreach here and we've got to be careful of overreach. There may be aspects of the New Zealand model that we need to take careful attention of, pay careful attention to, but I'm certainly of the view that there is value. However, it can't be in isolation of other reforms that make sense of the role it's going to play in Australia post-2025. So it's a cautionary endorsement of it. I think the evidence we got from a whole range of areas during the interim review consultation process demonstrated that it was timely to reintroduce the concept into Australia.
Thanks, Barney. Giselle, can I come to you? You're living it. It's a lived experience. Let me equally get my one provocative question to you. Does it add value into that essential operating model of higher education, tertiary education in Aotearoa?
Oh, kia ora, Stephen. So my key message is be careful what you wish for. Because, Barney, how you have described a Tertiary Education Commission, it has a clear agenda. It putatively has a start and finish date, and it has a very clear remit. I think what we've seen here in New Zealand over the last 20 years, since our TEC was established, is extraordinary mission drift for one reason or another. Now, from a public taxpayer perspective, it makes sense to have a body, as the TEC was first envisaged to be, to do that coordinating between all parts of the tertiary sector, which includes universities, to look at differentiation, to think about national capability, to make sure that we don't inadvertently lose any, that we are, future-proofing, that we are indeed thinking about how we prepare for the future for our nation and prepare the workforce, and adroit and adept at responding to big challenges like AI and so on and so forth. I think over time, and this is a fairly common view in New Zealand, from a university perspective, and certainly someone like me in my role as Provost, it's enormously time-consuming in terms of compliance, in terms of regulation. They have literally morphed from being a partner to a entity that in the last couple of weeks has clawed back funding that we are not going to be using in terms of our domestic load. And that was counter to a decision made about 6 weeks ago, whereby extra funding was given to the universities. It was an underspend, so it was effectively a reallocation, but it made a good news story without sounding too cynical. So we've seen overreach. We have seen massive bureaucracy. And also, if I might say, some real tension and possibly confusion around where the lines of alignment fall and where they start and finish with the Ministry of Education, with quality assurance agencies, and so on. So the Tertiary Education Commission, I think, as a concept, has great promise, but I think the real care needs to be taken in its execution. I think the one thing that our TEC are doing really well at the moment, and they do always refer to themselves as the funder, the investor. I have seen extraordinary mission drift into them wanting to create and devise and architect policy, which is actually the job of other government agencies. But the one area is around that audacious goal of achieving equity and driving that agenda. And that's been a single-minded piece of work. And I think that's something that, all the universities are on board with now. So we're all doing that. But as I say, there's no extra money to do it. So I think it really is a cautionary tale. Barney, do look at the New Zealand experience, because I think, what you are describing there sounds eminently sensible. And it's really interesting because in the current climate where universities are having to make hard decisions about what subjects and disciplines we can continue to support, at the moment the TEC is actually facilitating the conversation about, the endangered species subjects and making sure we don't lose national capability, particularly in areas like foreign languages. So what are the creative solutions there? Now that should be, I think, absolutely within the wheelhouse of what a TEC does in terms of thinking on behalf of the nation, because, frankly, everyone else in the tertiary ecosystem is conflicted in one way or another. Everyone else has a particular mission that they are working towards, and they have stakeholders they're delivering to. So I think there's real promise there in the impartiality. So I think it's potentially a good idea, but watch out for the mission drift.
Yeah, look, you make a good point. I think it's actually true of any sort of quasi-government authority that's set up to do any purpose for any length of time, whether in perpetuity or with a fixed term. There is always the danger of mission drift, unfortunately. It's often the nature of the legislation that establishes the particular entity that needs to be well crafted. And it's always down to the political dimension to this, the extent to which the government of the day, the minister of the day, is comfortable with the way the particular entity is functioning. So there are all of those dimensions that have to be taken into account. What I think is really important, or perhaps two really important elements. One is its terms of reference and its focus from the outset, and the conversation that goes into determining that. I mean, I remember the conversation that went on in the sector around the establishment of TEQSA, our Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, and the discussion over the legislation. This activated vice-chancellors right across the sector, so many people for a lot of time leading up to the establishment of our regulator. And I think for all of the challenges of our regulator, it's been an incredibly important part of ensuring the quality of the system, but often frustratingly so. The relationship between regulators and the Tertiary Education Commission, if it's established, is an important dimension to this. TEQSA, ASQA, the Australian Skills Qualifications Agency for the tertiary system, these have an important role to play as regulators. What's the interplay with the Tertiary Education Commission? So getting it right at the outset is vitally important. One of the elements I like and I'm drawn to about it, if done well, is that if the Accord delivers, the Accord will deliver a set of recommendations for government to consider. Nature of the beast. If the government determines that those recommendations are acceptable in some form or other and decides a timeframe for implementation, I can see a role for a Tertiary Education Commission to play in helping the sector and government with the implementation over time of those recommendations, because it's very clear that the change we need in higher education in Australia is not going to come about in one budget cycle or one government cycle. It is going to take time, and we have to be patient because of the complexity of tertiary education. So having an agency well supported, well governed, with the right relationship with the Commonwealth, but also the right independence from the Commonwealth, I would like to think that that's going to give us a greater chance of achieving the outcomes. You highlight one really valuable element of that in the equity space in New Zealand, and I think that's exactly the sort of thing we'd want to see in the Australian context as we move to target setting, again, on equity places in universities, for example, and how that fits with skills. And the other element here, perhaps to finish on this one, the relationship between an entity like a Tertiary Education Commission, if it's established, and Jobs and Skills Australia. Because right now we have established Jobs and Skills Australia. One of the first things the Albanese government did, Peter Dawkins, a former Vice-Chancellor heading it up, doing some really interesting work at the moment on trying to understand the skills landscape and the architecture of our skills classification in Australia, its relationship with TAFE, VET and higher education, giving us for the first time a bit of a sense of a common language between skills and competencies and the curriculum we offer in higher education, the components of that. But it's going to be a really important part of understanding where do we have to head as a nation to address the skills shortages now and looming in the future. What does that mean from a Tertiary Education Commission perspective about the resources we need to ensure universities and tertiary education more broadly can actually deliver graduates with those skills when they're needed? So it's a complex interplay, I think, but I'm reassured to a certain extent because of the early, very valuable work being done by the JSA.
Thanks, Barney. I've posted into chat, we're moving into the Q&A section. Again, take it as an opportunity to post a comment if you want, and the panelists can respond. Equally an opportunity for a question. We had an earlier question around the role of a commission and potentially the compliance, and Giselle, I think you touched on that. One issue that we haven't touched on, it's an Australian reference, the Australian Qualifications Framework, but Giselle, I'd be interested in your thoughts on micro-credentials. You know, again, the notion of, is the sector evolving? Is it short, sharp, responsive? Is it meeting the needs of industry? And, you know, that a comment, that a an issue I can get you to just reflect on, the place of micro-credentials in the modern university sector.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and good question. Before I come to that, I'll just touch briefly on Barney's comments around the Tertiary Education Commission before we leave that. And I think, Barney, your comments around, looking at skill projections, future needs, and then reverse engineering from that, I think that's a really good reason to think about the existence of a TEC. And just to go back to the equity goals again and that mission, I think that if we didn't have a TEC holding our feet to the fire, keeping us accountable in terms of our mission to close the gaps, I'm not confident that actually we'd be at the stage at the moment, because it's that mandate is there, and the appetite to make that kind of change varies across providers. So actually, I think that in itself, I think, is a really good justification for a Tertiary Education Commission. So you've convinced me there, Barney, on that one. On the question around,
I think you're already convinced on that one, Giselle, because I think you suggested it as a compelling reason. But I think you're right. It is about exactly as you just put it, right? And this has not happened in Australia, right? We look at data, like now, if you pick up on where Denise Bradley left things in 2008, which led to a number of recommendations, some of which were accepted by government, demand-driven system being an element of that. And that was directly linked to low SES and other equity group participation in higher education. Well, you go on now 15 years, and no, we have not met the equity participation rate. We monitor it, but we don't set ourselves the goal of putting the heat on the feet of the institutions and the vice-chancellors that need to deliver against it. And that's been missing in a way. There's been incentives, but actually I don't think we've had the intensity of focus on the importance of that issue for a number of years. And without it, you get creep, you get mission drift away from that as a priority. So I think you're right. You've convinced me about it now, Giselle.
Giselle, can I take you back to micro-credentials?
Back to micro-credentials.
Sorry, micro-credentials.
Yeah, look, sorry. So I think we look to Australia and we look at the incentives that you have there for innovation and micro-credentials. So the micro-creds in our context really came out of the sort of trade training, vocational education space. And that is where they tend to reside. There's not a huge level of interest in the university sector in micro-credentials, but by the same token, it's about the affordability, the funding models associated with that. So, if it's not passing the full cost on to the learner, and we're actually offering these as fee for service, then it's a question of, decomposing our accredited academic offer and thinking about how we pathway scaffold students in. I think in Australia, you are significantly ahead of the conversation that we're having here in Aotearoa around micro-credentials. And I think we've been focusing on other things, and particularly around the equity agenda, particularly around the vocational education reforms and so on. And at the moment, it's really around the sustainability of our institutions going forward, and then grappling with big challenges like artificial intelligence and generative AI, the kind of things that have the real potential to turn our worlds upside down. So I think it's kind of, it's around the edges, Stephen. It's not we haven't really seen the policy settings or indeed the incentives there for at least universities to really dive into this space, boots and all. So that would be my reflection at this point in time. But I do think that there is absolutely a role to play if we're looking at skill development for the future.
Yeah, no, I'm really keen to comment on this one, Stephen. Fortunately, Giselle, Jan and I have had a session on would the next Vice-Chancellor be generative AI? And we both took some time to come to the conclusion that that's probably not the case. So that's reassuring, I think, to Vice-Chancellors around the country, both countries. So we've dealt with generative AI. It's not going to take our job immediately. But on micro-credentials, this is a really interesting conversation to have. You'll see them mentioned through the interim report. And they're very much, if you take the Business Council of Australia, BCA here, my Chancellor, Professor Jennifer Westacott is Chief Executive, just standing down from that role in the next few weeks. But Jennifer has been a very strong proponent of new forms of credentialing that are going to give flexible, stackable credentials for to meet the needs of industry in upskilling. And of course, you know, to use a phrase like, you know, decomposing the curriculum sounds as if it sounds pretty horrible, but in a way, it is trying to stack up the curriculum in a new and interesting way. Now, and in New South Wales, we've had at least the beginnings of an attempt to understand this a little bit better structurally, and I think that's instructive in this sense. Certainly has been helpful to me. Peter Shergold and David Gonski put together a report on tertiary education a couple of years ago here in New South Wales. One of their recommendations was to establish an Institute for Applied Technology. And this was a model that was really built on a new form of degree, built from micro-credentials being stacked up, industry-driven. So the idea of these institutes, it turns out we now have two of them, one in digital technology and one in construction innovation, involving universities, TAFE New South Wales, and industry partners. And the first one, the digital technologies one, I think is the most important because it's ahead of the construction innovation one. So the model is interesting. It's micro skills as well as micro credentials. They've had a massive response to the micro skills enrolments. They've had, and I think 16 or 17,000 students in the first few months that have come in to do these micro skills. It's actually been quite challenging for the two universities, Macquarie and UTS, working with TAFE to design the curriculum, to have it informed by the needs of industry, to find ways to stack these micro skills and micro credentials together. And then importantly, to come up with your point, Giselle, how do you fund these things? What's the contribution that should be made by a student to their learning? And this is something you might like to take out to the national level in a conversation in a minute, Stephen. What's the student contribution? What's a government contribution because of public benefit? What's industry doing in this space? Where, you know, you look at an advanced apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships in the UK, very interesting model of funding, you know, earn while you work, earn while you learn type models rather than work integrated learning. In a very interesting model, but with a, you know, a levy on industry to help fund it. So what's the funding model? So the IATs in New South Wales have come up with a funding model and also a sort of a quantum of learning to associate with the micro-credential. The other point I was going to finish on here. So I think we've got emerging models that are worth looking at, undergraduate and potentially postgrad. But the thing, and I may be a lone voice in this regard, Giselle, amongst provosts and DVC's academic in Australia and others, I think we've got to give more structure to what a micro-credential is. Because I think the definition, thank you to the Australian government for their contribution on this one, I think it was anything from 1 hour to 1 semester could be a micro-credential, something less than 1 semester, more than 1 hour. Well, that's about as useful as a half-inch of string. It really isn't the most powerful policy setting I've ever heard from the Australian government. However, I think there are some models emerging where people are beginning to block up. The block model at Victoria University is turning out to be very interesting. You know, 4-week block model teaching. You've got, I think, 6-week block model at Southern Cross now they're developing. You know, you've got something around about, you know, 1/16 of an EFSL in the Australian language being associated with the micro-credential. I think we've got to break the back of the structures and the definitions. And then I think there is a huge opportunity here to really work closely with industry to drive reform. I mean, you'll need some AQF changes as well, because we need to have a fit-for-purpose Australian qualifications framework. And you'll see in the interim report, we talk about the Peter Noonan recommended changes to the AQF needing to be brought in. Stephen, I think this is one of the really exciting parts of the interim report, one where I think that the Australian government, I hope, will respond to this and think really carefully about providing us with some architecture that could be world leading. There was a report came out just recently on global trends in micro-credentials, and it talked about New Zealand, it talked about Australia, Europe, elsewhere in the world. This is not just confined to our part of the Southern Hemisphere. This is a conversation going on very broadly. We're announced recently our new campus to open in Surabaya in Indonesia. And one of the interesting comments from the Indonesian government was, well, we're interested in Industry 4.0 and micro-credentials, and we're interested in sustainable development goals. Can your university help to provide us with more accessible micro-credentials that, yes, can stack up? And really differently to MOOCs, these have got to stack up. They've got to be, like Lego. They've got to bolt together. And I know your decomposition image will remain in my mind, Giselle, but I have a feeling that this one could be the most significant shift we've seen for a long time, but the architecture is way off.
Yeah,
Thanks, Barney. Giselle, that industry point, the context of that place and role for industry in and in partnership with universities.
Well, in Aotearoa, Stephen, that's really happening within the vocational space at the moment as part of the Te Kunenga, the review of vocational ed. So we've got regional skills leadership groups that have been established. We've got various other councils that are working very closely, designing curriculum, co-constructing it with industry. The vocational space at the moment in New Zealand is the space where I expect to see some of that innovation. And particularly, Barney, I think in terms of the micro-creds, the work integrated learning, the learning integrated work kind of thing. We've got in our universal funding system, so we've got a new funding system that sits across the whole of all of us, but the permission, I think, in the agency within the vocational space under the umbrella of Te Kunenga to really work some of these things out. In the university space, one of the breaks, I think, on innovating in micro-creds has been, like you, Barney, we don't have a really clear structure. I think in the NZQF definition, a micro-credential is anything that is the equivalent of 5 to 40 credit points, and then that, you can retrofit that back to hours. Not particularly helpful, but also our current funding education performance indicators are totally predicated on course completion and qualification completion. And, there's a big piece of work to be done, I think, in our sector, looking at why our learners come to our universities and what do they hope to take out of it. We have so many students here at Massey, and this is purely anecdotal, so many students who come in and they will, in some respects, not even complete a course. They might do, or a unit in your language. They might do a couple of units, and then that's all they need. Now, we can issue them with a certificate of proficiency or something like that, but by and large, there's no way to, in our current system, to have the flexibility to acknowledge that bundle of learning that then assist that learner to go on and get the job they want, to go on and move forward with their life. So we've got a pretty inflexible kind of structure at the moment, which sits at odds, I think, Barney, and in some tension with that kind of wild flexibility of how we think about micro-creds. And I think, personally, that's why we haven't made much progress here in New Zealand, because we've kind of been tied up in that sort of Gordian knot of, how do we move forward? But, I agree with you. I think, decoupling time from competency, how do we really do that in a way that, that makes sense, that we can still run organisations, that we're not going to just, spill into chaos, because you need some kind of order around that. But in order to keep pace with the private providers, in order to keep pace with the online provision, and, the competition is fierce and the competition is global, we've really got to be thinking about that. So I'm really excited about, what might evolve in the next sort of 12 months in Aotearoa post the election, if there is a change of government, what the new settings might look like, and how we can do that in a manner that is wholly consistent with this very strong commitment that we've made to equity and access and maintaining excellence alongside that.
And I think, though, Giselle, you touch on it, and there's a couple of questions or comments, I think, in the chat that are touching on this. I wouldn't mind bringing in. I think Elisa and Gabby have made comment here. micro-credentials matching sort of the evolving level of focus we often see in society now. So shorter, sharper, maybe that's something that people are gravitating towards. I think Gabby's very insightful comment here in a way that, and I think it comes back to something I said earlier, we are seeing a lot of students, prospective students, emerging from the end of their secondary education and really not finding a way to engage again with higher education or tertiary education. And one thing that micro-credentials in the right setting can do is to give people some goal achievement relatively quickly, to give and build success that might keep them engaged in the educational process, but allow them to move out and come back again too. If you look at it in a lifelong learning context, which I think is really important in the way we've crafted in the interim review, is to say, well, you know, people talk about the number of careers people are going to have in a lifetime now because of the changing nature of the economy and digital and AI and all of those things that will impact on people. All very true, I'm sure. Just means even more learning. If you think of the bulk of learning a person does in a lifetime, well, a lot of it was concentrated in that period up until they're about 24, 25. Now it's spreading much more. And I think that's another way in which micro-credentials can help people at just the right time to upskill, to make themselves more employable, or to enable them to make a career change without it having to contribute massively to their debt in the context of, you know, whether or not they're borrowing money or using income contingent loans or whatever it might be. And as a final comment, something I think you and I both recall from the Northern Territory, Giselle, from the time up there, one thing that I know we found in our TAFE area of a dual sector university like Charles Darwin, often particularly in our remote communities, they would not finish the entirety of a qualification, a vet qualification, primarily because they didn't need all the competencies in order to actually be able to do the tasks they needed to do or to have the employment opportunity that they saw in the context of that community. And I think sometimes we should be giving credit for that and celebrating it instead of using it as a negative and saying, well, you know, you've had people attriting from the program. No, we haven't. They've found their micro skill and they've run with it. We should accredit the micro skill and let them come back and do other micro skills to make up a competency or set of competencies over time. So I think there is something here in the changing nature of engagement for some of our students. And I think there's benefit in getting this right. It'd be great to see Australia and New Zealand develop a world-leading model for micro-credentials rather than, I think this has been captured a little bit by our great Deputy Vice-Chancellor academic colleagues across Australia who seem to think, don't interfere in this space. Just let it unfold like 1,000 flowers blooming. I think we need to design this particular system much better.
Oh,
Thanks,
Barney, I'm with you on that. Sorry, Stephen, if I can just, you know, I mean, I think as Julianne has said in the chat here, you know, just having those on-ramp, off-ramp, you know, that flexibility really does drive online learning. And I love the phrase you're using, Barney, around the micro skills piece, because that just presupposes a certain way of thinking. And it really is then, you know, thinking about a learner-centric approach, right, rather than an institution-centric approach. So I think purposeful design is absolutely needed in this space. And to your point, Barney, about, you know, how about we make this an Australasian kind of network? Well, you know, if we can be a bit more freewheeling and a bit more flexible in terms of those micro creds, then, you know, might that assist some of us who are, you know, struggling to hold on to particular subjects and disciplines and areas whereby we can collaborate, you know, across the Tasman. I mean, you know, we have an arrangement at Massey with UNE where we teach Spanish and have done for 10 years. We white label it through UNE. Fabulous arrangement, but, you know, couldn't we do that with micro credentials? Couldn't we do that, you know, in a much more open and transparent way so that we can build the capability of both countries? Yeah.
Look, I absolutely agree. You know, one of the comments that have come up to the Accord panel through various submissions has been around a universal service obligation, concept on higher education providers, and you're touching on it. We have an obligation, and this is very true in regional Australia, as I'm sure it is in many ways in New Zealand. We need to keep some disciplines alive. And it may be, you know, at the moment, I know between Western Sydney University and the University of Newcastle, we're looking at how do we develop and support podiatry between us. When you see numbers are making one or other program more fragile, let's work together to deliver podiatry. How could we've done the same thing in languages in Australia? I'm pretty sure teaching Mandarin in Auckland is not a lot different to teaching Mandarin in Australia, apart from the New Zealand accent and the Australian accent, confusing everybody. But nevertheless, it seemed to me we could do a great deal. I think micro-credentials could be a common, if we can actually get a commonality there, I think it could be hugely beneficial across the two sectors. I noticed Jan in the news the other day doing something really innovative with some offshore programs for Massey. You know, I think we need to look at ways we operate in the international domain as much as we can operate just across our two countries. I think the Australian Constitution still allows New Zealand to join, I think, doesn't it, Giselle?
Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
Somebody mentioned it recently. I'm just saying.
We're into our last 10 minutes, and I need to give 5 minutes back to ML and to Sophie. Giselle, Barney, can I ask you both to make a concluding comment in the context of, let's make it less the Accord, let's make it politics, but I guess bold reform for the sector into the future. Short, sharp concluding comment. Giselle.
Okay, just well, in conclusion, I think, you know, advice or comments to the sector would be, as I started, you know, just a plea to whoever is leading government and whoever has the agency in terms of design, is to really simplify so that we can continue as universities to deliver on our missions, to be anchor institutions in our communities, and to really think about how we can be sustainable beyond growth. I think that's you know, predicated on our current model. But because this is something that is very close to my heart, as Barney knows, you know, we have made an audacious goal for ourselves around closing parity gaps, around the equity agenda, and I think that is our call to arms really in this country, and it's part of a wider effort in our society here in Aotearoa New Zealand to truly recognise and realise Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the promise of that agreement and what it actually means in the modern 21st century context. And so really excited to see, you know, the voice discussions in Australia, to see the referendum coming up. I think it's more or less about the same time as the election here in Aotearoa New Zealand. So it just feels like it's a moment of reckoning for universities. And, you know, just to reclaim our space, I think, and our mission and our purpose, our reason for being, but also not to be afraid to evolve within that context, because that's the nature of the beast.
Thanks, Giselle. Much appreciated. Barney?
Look, I agree with Giselle. This is actually an incredibly important moment. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, in Australia, we have 3 big reviews. We should never imagine that a review of one component of the education system is ever going to actually shift the dial. We need to be looking, you know, the first 2,000 days through to lifelong learning. We need in Australia desperately to review early childhood, early learning. We need to review the schools reform program. Our NAPLAN results are challenging for Australia. And then you move into the tertiary system. We need a more integrated tertiary system, and we need that parity of esteem between our strong polytechnics, in our case, our big TAFEs, and our universities, and then to have a lifelong learning component to it. We really do want to recognise the transformational nature of education to people's lives. And equity is at the heart of that transformation. I think one of the things that Mary O'Kane has identified in the interim report is, in Australia, growth to address our skills needs is through equity, participation and success. It is at the core. Let's make that work. We can learn a lot across from New Zealand and the great successes New Zealand has had, and the challenges and what we've done in Australia, well, badly, indifferently. now is a moment of reckoning, I think, for our two systems. And I'm confident, always confident, Giselle knows it, always genetically optimistic, and I'm very optimistic at the moment. I'm looking forward to the final report from the Accord and the outcome of the New Zealand election and what that's going to say about higher education.
Thanks, Barney. Thanks to you as well. Sophie, ML, I'll hand back to you for the concluding aspects.
Kia ora, Giselle, kia ora, Barney, Stephen. An important moment in time, and obviously the start of the Australian and New Zealand Academic Consortium. I really, how often do we, as the group in the room here of 60 plus of us, get the opportunity to listen to some senior, Vice Chancellor, Provost, DBC, having these types of discussions, and from the heart. So I really would like to thank and acknowledge you all. So many challenges at the moment for the sector, but Barney, I'm pleased that you're optimistic. I think that's the only way to be. And I think, yes, despite all those challenges, the similarities for New Zealand and Australia come through loud and strong, and equity is definitely at the heart, and obviously there's ways that we can work together. So many thanks for another great and bold conversation, and thank you, Stephen, for guiding it.